The hearing room was silent enough to hear the hum of the cameras. Rows of faces waited, some curious, some cautious, others ready to twist every word into tomorrow's headlines. Jerome Powell sat in his usual posture, straight-backed, measured, the embodiment of calm control. He'd done this 100 times, but not like this. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett adjusted her mic. Her fingers didn't tremble. She'd memorized this moment, every syllable of it. When she finally spoke, her tone wasn't loud. It was surgical. Chairman Powell, where did the $6 trillion actually go? The words landed like a gunshot in a cathedral. Powell blinked once, twice. A few papers rustled. Somewhere behind him, an aide swallowed hard. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Crockett leaned forward slightly, eyes locked on him. Because out there, people can't afford rent. They can't buy groceries. And yet, somehow, $6 trillion moved through your system like a ghost. So I'll ask again, where did it go? The crowd of journalists tensed, pens frozen midair. Even the camera operators seemed to forget they were filming. Powell cleared his throat. His voice came out softer than usual, almost defensive. Congresswoman, those funds were part of emergency liquidity measures during the pandemic response. She cut in, sharp as a razor. Liquidity? You mean printing money? You mean flooding the market while real people drowned? A low murmur rolled through the room. A senator on the panel glanced at his notes, pretending not to listen, but everyone was listening. Powell tried to recover. We took necessary steps to prevent collapse. The outcomes, though imperfect, she interrupted again, her voice steady. You call record inflation and vanishing savings imperfect. Chairman, with respect, that's not imperfection. That's negligence with a calculator. Someone coughed. Someone else whispered. The cameras zoomed closer. Powell's face was a careful sculpture of restraint, but his eyes betrayed unease. Crockett didn't move. I'm not asking for excuses. I'm asking for truth. $6 trillion. The American people deserve an answer they can understand. Powell's silence was its own confession. The tension thickened, almost visible in the air. For the first time, he looked like a man cornered by his own numbers. And as Crockett sat back, a faint, knowing smile flickered across her face. Because everyone in that room knew this was only the beginning. But no one, not even Powell himself, was ready for what that question would reveal next. 2 days earlier, the world outside Washington felt like it was cracking at the seams. Grocery aisles looked the same, but every price tag was heavier than before. A loaf of bread that once cost $1 now mocked families at $3. Gas stations had become confessionals where strangers sighed about bills, rent, and dreams slipping out of reach. $6 trillion had flooded the veins of the economy, but the people who needed it most never felt the pulse. In the marble corridors of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell rehearsed stability. He practiced his phrases in the mirror. Transitory inflation, market adjustment, policy calibration. Each word was a wall, polished to deflect blame. Behind closed doors, advisors whispered about the growing anger outside. The headlines calling the Fed's response the most expensive experiment in modern history. But Powell's face stayed calm. He'd survived market crashes, political storms, and the unspoken arrogance of untouchable power. To him, this hearing was another performance. Across town, Jasmine Crockett sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by papers and coffee stains. Her eyes traced graphs and testimonies, not as a politician chasing headlines, but as a citizen haunted by them. She thought about her constituents, the single mother who worked 3 jobs, the retiree whose savings vanished in months, the college graduate drowning in debt. Every chart she read told the same story. Someone was profiting while millions were paying. Her aide entered quietly, holding a printout of Powell's prepared statement. He's going to talk in circles again, they said. Crockett didn't look up. Then I'll draw a line through them. She closed her laptop, staring at the folded note she kept in her planner, a quote from her father. If you want to see who a man serves, watch where the money goes. That was her mission, not to chase numbers, but to chase truth through the maze of them. She wasn't walking into that hearing to embarrass a man. She was walking in to remind America that its institutions were supposed to serve people, not portfolios. Meanwhile, financial networks played endless loops of pundits debating who was to blame. Some blamed Congress, some the White House, but few dared to question the unelected guardians of the dollar. It was easier to accept inflation as a mystery than admit someone had opened the floodgates. Outside the Capitol, cameras were already setting up. Commentators predicted routine testimony, nothing explosive. But inside, a current was shifting. Quiet, invisible, inevitable. Crockett had done her homework, traced every dollar she could, followed every statement Powell had made since the first emergency stimulus. Her folder was heavy, but her conviction was heavier. She paused before leaving her office and looked at the city skyline. $6 trillion, she whispered, as if testing the weight of the number one last time. Her aide hesitated at the door. You think he'll answer you straight? Crockett smiled faintly. No, but I'm not asking for him. I'm asking for everyone he's forgotten. Somewhere deep inside the Fed's headquarters, Powell signed one last memo before his driver arrived. He didn't know it yet, but the next 48 hours would define his legacy. because Jasmine Crockett wasn't just preparing to ask about missing money. She was about to confront America's moral debt, and when the cameras went live, Powell thought it would be business as usual, until she began her line of questioning. Jerome Powell had always believed in systems. Systems didn't lie, didn't feel, didn't panic. They could be modeled, adjusted, corrected, like an orchestra that obeyed its conductor, as long as his timing was perfect. From the halls of Princeton to the marble offices of Wall Street, Powell had built a career on the elegance of numbers. He learned early that confidence was currency, and he spent it lavishly. In every photo from his youth, his expression was the same: composed, distant, precise. The kind of face that could assure a nation everything was fine, even when it wasn't. That calm had become his brand. Even when markets tumbled or currencies shivered, Powell's voice stayed steady, like a lullaby for the anxious elite. Temporary, he'd say. Contained, and for years, people believed him, because he looked like the kind of man you were supposed to believe. But beneath the veneer of control lived an old fear, the loss of it. He'd never admit it, not even to himself, but every press conference carried a quiet dread. What if this time the markets didn't listen? What if this time his words didn't work? Behind his polished language, policy tools, adjusted targets, macro stability, was a trembling truth. He wasn't steering the machine anymore. He was chasing it. In private meetings, he'd glance at the charts, jagged red lines where green ones should have been, and feel the pulse quicken behind his collar. His advisors talked in euphemisms: transitory inflation, post-pandemic correction, consumer confidence lag, but he saw it clearly: wages stagnant, debt climbing, and yet asset bubbles swelling like helium balloons in a windstorm. The system he'd sworn to stabilize was feeding on itself. Still, Powell's public tone never faltered. At press briefings, he'd smile politely, reciting optimism as if reading scripture. The U.S. economy remains resilient, he'd declare, but on Main Street, families clipped coupons, delayed doctor visits, and prayed that rent wouldn't rise again. That was a cruel paradox. The man entrusted with protecting the dollar seemed increasingly detached from those forced to chase it. His rise had been smooth, inevitable even. He was the safe choice, the bipartisan pick. Republicans liked his restraint. Democrats liked his composure. Wall Street adored his predictability. He knew how to soothe panic without promising reform, how to sound empathetic without giving ground. In meetings with bankers, his charm was surgical: gentle nods, carefully timed smiles, and an aura of quiet authority that made people lower their voices around him. But power, over time, dulls empathy, and Powell's world had shrunk to numbers on a page, graphs in motion, levers to pull. Each decimal point replaced a person, each data set, a family's story. To him, the economy wasn't a landscape of lives. It was a system of signals, a puzzle to balance. And yet, somewhere deep inside, he knew what the numbers meant. He saw the irony, the cruel symmetry between the Fed's liquidity injections and the surge of Americans living paycheck to paycheck. He saw corporate profits inflate while savings accounts deflated. But acknowledging that truth would mean admitting the limits of control. And men like Jerome Powell weren't built to admit limits. There were moments, brief and unwanted, when the facade cracked. Late nights in his office, long after the lights had dimmed, he'd linger over the data. Lines on a chart became human silhouettes in his mind. Workers, parents, retirees. He'd feel the weight of their invisible suffering pressing against his immaculate spreadsheet. Then, with a blink, he'd push it away. The system required confidence, not conscience. When Congress announced the upcoming hearing, he told his staff it was routine. "I've done this before," he said, adjusting his tie in the mirror. His reflection looked the part. Composed, respectable, unassailable. But there was a flicker in his eyes, a recognition that the narrative was slipping. Inflation wasn't subsiding. Public trust was eroding. For the first time, he wasn't certain he could talk his way out. Still, he rehearsed his talking points with mechanical precision: stabilization measures, employment recovery, long-term resilience. Each phrase is designate to pacify, not provoke. He believed that data could still drown dissent, that numbers, properly arranged, could smother outrage. But outside his bubble of control, a new kind of accountability was brewing. It wasn't coming from markets or media. It was coming from a congresswoman unafraid to speak the language of ordinary people. Someone who didn't flinch at power. Someone who wouldn't be lulled by jargon. Powell adjusted his cufflinks one last time. Before stepping into the car that would take him to the Capitol, he looked calm, but inside, a faint unease pulsed like static, an instinct he hadn't felt in years. Because while Jerome Powell rehearsed data points, Jasmine Crockett was rehearsing something else: truth, sharpened into a single question, before the cameras, before the headlines, before the storm that would rattle the financial elite. There was Jasmine Crockett, alone in her small Texas office, surrounded by stacks of case files and unpaid bills from clients who couldn't afford justice. The hum of a flickering light above her cast long shadows across walls covered in newspaper clippings. Stories of families losing homes, small towns vanishing, and wages that hadn't grown since her childhood. She'd lived it. She'd breathed it. And now, She carried it with her like fire in her lungs. In the silence of that night, the clock ticked with the rhythm of a heartbeat. Outside, the world slept under the weight of rising prices and broken promises. Inside, Crockett read every line of the Federal Reserve's reports, tracing the flow of money like a detective tracing fingerprints. 6 trillion, the number repeated in her mind like a siren, not abstract, but personal. 6 trillion reasons people couldn't afford rent. 6 trillion reasons grocery bills were devouring paychecks. 6 trillion reasons the American dream had been repossessed. She leaned back, rubbing her temples, exhaustion lining her face, but not dimming her resolve. They think we won't understand the language, she murmured, flipping through another report. They hide injustice behind acronyms and charts. Her aide, Marcus, standing by the door with a cup of coffee, gave her a worried look. Jasmine, this hearing, it's not like the others. You go after Powell like this, you'll make enemies in every room that matters. She looked up, a slow smile spreading. Then let's make it worth it. That line wasn't bravado, it was conviction. Crockett wasn't chasing headlines. She was chasing truth, the kind that cuts through the marble walls of Washington and echoes in living rooms across the country. She knew the danger of being the one woman willing to stand up and say, explain this, especially when the explanation could shatter the illusion of control the Fed had built around itself. Her journey hadn't started in politics. It started in the courtroom, fighting for people who couldn't afford representation, people written off as statistics. She'd seen mothers lose homes because a policy made by men in suits said the math didn't work. She'd seen neighborhoods gutted while Wall Street cheered the recovery. Every case, every heartbreak, carved her voice into something sharper. The kind of voice that, when it finally reached Congress, refused to soften its edges. In Washington, that voice was a disruption. They called her fiery, combative, emotional, words that men in power used when they were afraid. But what they couldn't see was the discipline behind that fire. Every question she asked was deliberate. Every confrontation was calculated. She didn't throw punches. She landed them where they'd hurt most. The hypocrisy hiding behind data. As she prepared for the hearing, she pinned a note to her folder. Accountability is not optional. Under it, a single line highlighted in yellow. Where did the $6 trillion go? She practiced it aloud, feeling its weight. Not shouted, not emotional, just calm. Surgical. She knew how to deliver it. Because this wasn't about theatrics. It was about truth stripped bare. The night grew late, and the sounds of Washington dimmed into quiet. Through the office window, the Capitol dome glowed, a symbol both inspiring and infuriating. Marcus packed up his things. You know, he said softly, most people would have stopped caring by now. She didn't look up from her notes. That's the problem, Marcus. They're counting on that. Her mind drifted back to her childhood in Dallas, her mother working double shifts, her father reminding her that silence is what power counts on. She carried that lesson through every courtroom and campaign speech. Now, as she read through Powell's testimony drafts, she could almost hear that voice again. Don't let them talk circles around justice. The more she studied, the clearer the pattern became. Trillions printed, inflation, justified as temporary, corporations posting record profits while families rationed food. It wasn't a mystery. It was math with moral consequences, and Jasmine Crockett had decided to make those consequences visible. When dawn finally broke, streaks of gold light cut across her desk, illuminating the line she'd underlined a dozen times. The American economy remains resilient. She laughed softly, a sound halfway between disbelief and defiance. Resilient, she whispered. Tell that to the single mother buying half the groceries she used to. She closed her binder, hands steady now. The exhaustion had turned into clarity. Tomorrow, she wouldn't just be a congresswoman, she'd be a mirror, forcing the man who held the nation's purse strings to face the reflection of what his decisions had cost. As she walked toward the door, Marcus handed her one last sheet, a risk assessment prepared by her staff. At the bottom, in bold letters, recommendation, avoid direct confrontation. She smiled, folded the paper, and slipped it into her bag. We're past that point. That night, the Capitol slept under the illusion of order, but Jasmine Crockett was awake and ready, because she knew what most people had forgotten. History doesn't change when power allows it. It changes when someone dares to ask the right question. And as she stepped into the corridor, lights flickering in the early morning quiet, her voice echoed softly to herself, steady and certain, a promise, not just to the people who sent her, but to every American left behind by the system she was about to challenge. And so, the stage was set, the room full of cameras, the country full of tension, for one question that would make the Fed tremble. The hearing room buzzed with the low hum of cameras and whispers. C-SPAN lights washed over polished oak desks, over nameplates, over the carefully neutral face of Jerome Powell, the man who had guided America's economic fate with quiet authority. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett adjusted her microphone. The air thickened. Chairman Powell, she began, her voice measured, deliberate. For the record, could you clarify where the $6 trillion injected into the economy actually went? He smiled faintly, the kind of smile meant to project composure. Congresswoman, much of that spending was part of our emergency measures to stabilize markets, support liquidity, and, she raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. Stabilize, she repeated softly. Stability for who? A murmur rippled through the room. The word hung there, simple, devastating. Powell blinked, his tone still polite. For the American economy, Congresswoman, for jobs, businesses, for businesses. She interrupted again. You mean the same corporations that used stimulus money to buy back their own stock? The same banks that posted record profits while families begged for rent relief? A pause. Powell's jaw tightened. We acted in the interest of the broader economy. Without intervention, the consequences would have been catastrophic. She leaned forward now, her tone calm but cutting. Chairman Powell, catastrophic for who? Because from where I sit, catastrophe already happened. It just didn't happen to Wall Street. The tension crackled like electricity. Even the journalists stopped typing. The question wasn't just aimed at Powell. It was aimed at an entire system. Powell adjusted his glasses, buying seconds. Congresswoman, monetary policy isn't about individual winners and losers. It's about systemic balance. Balance, she said, her voice rising slightly, not in anger, but in disbelief. Do you hear yourself? You printed $6 trillion. $6 trillion. And the result was working Americans paying more for groceries, gas, rent, everything. You call that balance? He straightened, his tone sharpening. Inflation was an unavoidable side effect of global disruptions. Our priority was preventing total collapse. And yet, she said, cutting in again, the collapse still came, just not for the people sitting in this room. Tell me, Chairman, do you know what it's like to choose between insulin and food? He hesitated. For the first time, his eyes broke from hers. Do you? She pressed. Because millions of Americans do. And every time the Fed decides to stabilize markets, it seems those Americans pay the price. Why is that? The silence that followed was heavy. Members of Congress shifted in their seats. Cameras zoomed in on Powell's face. Controlled, but no longer unshaken. He inhaled deeply. Congresswoman, these are complex global forces. No one institution has complex forces, she repeated, her tone now almost a whisper. Chairman, you keep saying that as if complexity excuses consequences, but behind every decimal you defend, there's a person. A worker, a child. You made choices, and choices have moral weight. For a moment, no one moved. Crockett's eyes were unflinching, her calm more powerful than any raised voice could have been. Powell cleared his throat. The Federal Reserve does not engage in moral decisions. Congresswoman, we engage in monetary decisions. That line, precise, mechanical, was his mistake. Crockett leaned closer, her voice low but resonant enough to pierce through the chamber. Then maybe that's the problem, Chairman, because when money and morality separate what's left of a nation. The words landed like a strike. Some in the audience nodded, others stared, stunned. Powell's aide scribbled frantic notes. The once untouchable technocrat now looked, for the briefest moment, uncertain. He shifted in his seat, searching for composure. Congresswoman, with respect, your rhetoric oversimplifies the complexity of economic. No, she said, interrupting with quiet force. It simplifies the truth. The hearing had transformed. What began as testimony was now something larger, a reckoning. Crockett's voice carried the weight of millions watching at home, people who'd felt invisible until now. Powell adjusted his tie, the mask of calm slipping just enough for the cameras to catch it. Congresswoman, if you have a specific allegation, she leaned back, exhaling slowly. Oh, I have something specific, Chairman, but I'm giving you one last chance to answer honestly. The room was utterly still now. Even the hum of electronics seemed to fade away. Powell's gaze met hers, a silent standoff between power and accountability. And then, Crockett paused, because what she was about to say next would change everything. The pause stretched long enough for the entire country to lean in. Hands rested calmly on her folder, a folder the color of midnight, thick with documents and data that glimmered faintly under the fluorescent light. Then, with the precision of someone who'd been waiting for this moment her whole life, she opened it. Chairman Powell, she said evenly, you said the Fed's actions were necessary to preserve stability. I'd like to show you what that stability looked like. Her aide moved swiftly, handing printed charts to the committee clerks. Within seconds, monitors across the room lit up. The graphs were brutal. Red spikes, blue troughs, names of corporations scrolling like credits at the end of a movie about greed. $6 trillion, she continued, her voice neither loud nor theatrical, just clear. That's the number you used to calm the markets. But let's look closer. According to the Fed's own disclosures, and I'll quote directly, more than 40% of those funds went to corporate bond purchases and liquidity, facilities designed to support financial institutions. Meanwhile, only a fraction reached households directly. Powell adjusted his microphone. Congresswoman, those facilities were essential to whom? She interjected. Because I don't see small businesses on this list. I don't see families. I see Morgan Stanley. I see BlackRock. I see Delta Airlines. You called it liquidity. My constituents call it theft. A gasp rippled through the chamber. Powell blinked rapidly, his fingers tightening around the edge of the desk. Congresswoman, those purchases were intended to stabilize credit markets. If the credit system collapsed, millions of jobs were already lost. She fired back. And yet, CEOs collected bonuses. Shareholders got buybacks, and you called that policy success. Crockett flipped another page. Each turn of paper sounded louder than any shout. Here's another number. 23 million Americans relied on food assistance during that same period. Did your models account for that? Powell's jaw clenched. Our models, she leaned forward. Your models failed, Chairman, not because you couldn't predict inflation, but because you never predicted what greed would do when you fed it. The room fell into a silence so heavy it felt like gravity itself had deepened. Somewhere in the back row, a journalist's fingers flew across a keyboard. Crockett dismantles Powell's defense line by line. Another tweet. Liquidity versus theft, the line of the year. The hearing was no longer a hearing. It was a live trial of morality, of policy, of the unspoken social contract between the powerful and the people. Powell exhaled slowly. Congresswoman, with respect, hindsight allows anyone to criticize. We acted under extraordinary pressure to prevent collapse. Crockett's tone softened, dangerously so. Chairman, I believe you. I believe you were under pressure, but pressure doesn't excuse blindness. She clicked a remote, revealing another slide. A timeline showing stimulus rollouts against corporate earnings. Do you see this? She asked. While you were flooding markets with cash, the top 1% gained $4 trillion in net worth. $4 trillion, Chairman. During a pandemic, meanwhile, the bottom half lost ground. You called that recovery? A voice from another representative's mic whispered. She's got him. Powell inhaled through his nose. Congresswoman, wealth distribution is not within the Fed's mandate. She didn't let him finish. And maybe that's the point. Maybe it should be. Because when policies protect profits over people, the mandate itself becomes immoral. He looked away, down at his papers. The data that once seemed bulletproof now reduced to dust in the face of human reality. Crockett's next words were quieter, slower. The rhythm of someone telling a painful truth. Do you know what happens? When a mother can't afford groceries because the price of eggs tripled, but billionaires buy another yacht? She doesn't call it inflation. She calls it betrayal. The audience in the gallery murmured, low and emotional. Even a few members of Congress nodded. Powell opened his mouth, but nothing came. The camera zoomed in. The man who'd once spoken for the global economy now looked like someone realizing, too late, that numbers could not defend him from the human cost of his equations. Crockett continued, not with anger, but with quiet conviction. You were trusted to protect the dollar, but you forgot to protect the people holding it. The silence that followed felt sacred. Then she leaned back slightly, letting the weight of her words hang in the air. So I'll ask again, Chairman Powell. Where did the $6 trillion go? Powell swallowed, his eyes glancing toward his aides. None dared meet his gaze. He adjusted his glasses, his voice suddenly smaller. Congresswoman, mistakes were made in our projections. Crockett didn't move, didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply looked at him, eyes unwavering, voice low. No, Chairman. Accountability was missing in your priorities. A thunderous murmur erupted, part applause, part disbelief. The gavel struck twice, trying to restore order. Cameras panned across the room, Crockett.com, and resolute. Powell, silent and exposed. And outside that chamber, the reaction ignited like wildfire. On social media, hashtags flooded every feed. Hashtag Crockett vs. Powell. Hashtag 6 trillion question. Hashtag accountability now. Clips of her words spread faster than analysis ever could. TikTok edits, YouTube shorts, even finance pages on Reddit replayed the moment she said you called it liquidity. My constituents call it theft. Commentators scrambled to react. A CNN anchor whispered mid-segment, did he just admit it? On Twitter, a journalist typed, this is the first time in years the Fed's chair looked genuinely shaken. Even within the Fed's marble halls, aides exchanged nervous glances, whispering that something irreversible had happened. The institution that once operated above public outrage was now center stage, and the people watching were angry, awake, and hungry for answers. Crockett gathered her papers with quiet grace. The storm she'd unleashed wasn't one of noise, it was one of truth, the kind that couldn't be contained by statements or sanitized by press releases. As she stood, Powell remained seated, still staring at the empty space where his authority had once lived untouched. And though he tried to compose himself, the cameras caught the tremor in his hand as he reached for his water glass. Because for the first time, the most powerful banker in the world had been forced to admit, not just a fiscal mistake, but a moral one. Crockett paused before leaving the microphone, her voice calm and final. Mr. Chairman, maybe it's time we stop stabilizing markets and start stabilizing lives. The audience erupted, not in applause, but in a collective intake of breath. A sound of realization, of reckoning. and as the gavel struck to adjourn, her words still echoed through the chamber and through every screen across America. But the shockwaves didn't stop in that room. They exploded across America. The video hit the internet before the hearing even ended. A journalist from The Hill clipped the moment Crockett said, "You called it liquidity. My constituents call it theft." By the time she stepped out of the chamber, it had already been retweeted 10,000 times. Within an hour, it was everywhere. Cable news anchors leaned in, replaying the clip in slow motion like it was a highlight reel from a championship match. "Watch this," one said, as Crockett leaned forward and Powell's expression shifted from polished calm to quiet panic. Hashtags bloomed like wildfire. Hashtag Crockett vs. Powell. Hashtag the 6 trillion question. Hashtag finally said it. TikTok creators stitched reactions. One caption read, "She didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard." Another, "This is how you hold power accountable." And then came the memes. Powell's face frozen mid-stammer, superimposed over burning dollar bills. Crockett, side by side with Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, captioned, "Women who asked the questions men feared." Across America, ordinary people felt something shift, not in policy, but in spirit. Truck drivers replayed the clip during lunch breaks. Teachers showed it in civics classes. A single mother in Ohio posted on Facebook, "I don't understand the economy, but I understand that woman's courage." Economists scrambled to interpret what had just happened. On Bloomberg, one analyst called Crockett's confrontation a populist lightning strike. On Fox Business, a host fumed that she was grandstanding for the cameras. But even his co-hosts admitted, grudgingly, "Well, she's got people talking about the Fed. That's never happened before." The political class wasn't immune. Within hours, senators from both sides issued statements, some calling for a review of the Fed's emergency measures, others quietly distancing themselves from Powell's decisions. The White House remained silent. But inside its walls, aides drafted talking points, unsure whether to applaud or contain the fire. Powell, for his part, vanished behind press briefings. His next scheduled interview on CNBC was abruptly postponed. When he did appear, days later, his tone was careful, his sentences shorter, his eyes scanning the floor before each answer. Gone was the quiet arrogance of command, replaced by the tremor of a man realizing he'd become a symbol of something larger than himself. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett's phone never stopped buzzing. News producers, talk shows, podcasts, everyone wanted a quote, a soundbite, a reaction, but she declined most of them. Instead, she posted one simple statement on X. "Accountability isn't radical, it's patriotic." That post alone reached 12 million views in a day, on coffee shops and classrooms. Her words became shorthand for truth-telling. A college debate team in Chicago replayed her exchange as a case study in courage. A grocery clerk in Detroit taped her quote to the register. Even late-night comedians joined in, not mocking her, but celebrating the rare sight of a politician standing tall without shouting. And beneath the noise, something deeper stirred. Faith. The kind of faith Americans hadn't felt in years. That maybe the system wasn't completely rigged. That maybe someone still remembered who it was supposed to serve. That cable networks ran specials. CNN's Kyron read, "The question that rocked the Fed." MSNBC aired a montage of public reactions, ending with the phrase, "Truth doesn't need to yell, it just needs a mic." Meanwhile, on conservative radio, hosts scrambled to contain the damage. "She's dangerous," one warned. "She's turning accountability into a political weapon." But the people listening didn't hear danger. They heard dignity. In classrooms, in union halls, in the small towns long forgotten by federal charts, people began to say her name with something like hope. Jasmine Crockett, the Congresswoman who made the Fed blink. And while she stayed quiet, the narrative grew louder on its own. Commentators began comparing her to the icons of past reform movements, the ones who asked uncomfortable questions and refused to look away when power flinched. Through it all, Powell remained silent. No more offhand remarks about transitory inflation. No more soft interviews. The man who once commanded markets now avoided microphones like they were landmines. It wasn't just a political moment anymore. It was a cultural one. Clips from the hearing played under music montages on Instagram, woven with images of grocery store shelves, gas prices, and struggling families. The caption read, "This isn't economics. This is America's reckoning." And as the days turned into weeks, something remarkable happened. Her approval ratings surged, not just among progressives, but independents, moderates, even some conservatives who said, reluctantly, at least she had the guts to ask. Late one night, a reporter caught Crockett leaving her office. "Congresswoman," he called out, "did you expect your question to go this viral?" She stopped, smiled faintly, and said, "I didn't ask it to go viral. I asked it because no one else would." The clip went viral anyway, and while America debated, reposted, and reacted, one truth echoed louder than any partisan spin. She had spoken the question everyone had been too afraid to ask, but what no one expected was how this single question would rewrite her. political destiny. The dust had settled, but the echo of that single question still pulsed through the nation like a heartbeat that refused to quiet. Weeks after the confrontation, Washington was no longer the same. Cable networks had moved on to new scandals. Yet Jasmine Crockett's voice still lingered, a reminder that truth, once spoken with conviction, cannot be unsaid. In her district back home, the air felt different. Town halls were packed again, not with cynicism, but with curiosity. People came not just to applaud her, but to understand what had truly happened. They weren't economists or policy experts. They were teachers, nurses, truck drivers, parents, Americans who had felt invisible for too long. Crockett stood before them, not as a viral sensation, but as one of them. The cameras didn't intimidate her anymore. They were merely witnesses to something deeper. The real debt isn't $6 trillion, she began, her voice steady and intimate. It's the trust we owe the American people. Every time we hide behind numbers, every time we excuse failure with complexity, we bankrupt that trust a little more. Silence filled the room. She paused, scanning the crowd. Faces stared back, weary, hopeful, proud. She continued, I didn't question Jerome Powell to humiliate him. I questioned him because someone had to. Because for every line on a balance sheet, there's a family wondering why groceries cost more, why rent never stops rising, why hard work feels like quicksand. Her tone softened. When the powerful make mistakes, they call it policy. When ordinary people make mistakes, they call it failure. That's the imbalance we must fix. It wasn't fiery rhetoric. It was raw truth. She spoke like a woman who carried the nation's frustration but still believed in its promise. And that belief, unpolished, unyielding, resonated across generations. Clips from her speech began circulating online, just like the confrontation weeks earlier. But this time, the tone was different. The hashtags weren't about outrage. They were about hope. Hashtag Crockett, hashtag truth over power. Late night hosts quoted her. Editorials called her the conscience Congress forgot it needed. Even former critics admitted that something about her words felt honest in a city allergic to sincerity. Meanwhile, Jerome Powell's public appearances dwindled. When he did speak, the confidence that once defined him seemed brittle. He had become the symbol of something greater than himself. Not villainy, but detachment. A reminder that systems built without empathy will eventually collapse under their own indifference. Crockett, on the other hand, became something rarer than a headline, a symbol of integrity. Invitations flooded in, universities, think tanks, advocacy groups, yet she declined most of them. Instead, she kept returning to her district, walking through schools, small businesses, and community centers, listening. Because, as she often said, you can't represent the people if you stop hearing their pain. Her aides noticed the shift. She wasn't just a rising star, she was evolving into a movement. A young volunteer once told her after an event, "You made people believe again." Crockett smiled, humbled. Then let's not waste that belief. And in that quiet resolve lay the true moral of her journey, that courage doesn't come from shouting the loudest in the room, but from daring to speak truth when silence is easier. The hearing had not changed the Federal Reserve overnight. Interest rates, inflation, and politics continued to grind through their cycles. But what had changed irrevocably was the sense that accountability was no longer optional in a world ruled by numbers. One woman had reminded a nation of its humanity, and as she stepped off the stage that night, a young mother approached her, holding her daughter's hand. "I just wanted to say," she whispered, "thank you for asking the question we all wanted to ask." Crockett smiled gently. "Then keep asking," she said. "That's how truth survives." She walked away beneath the hum of fluorescent lights, her reflection flickering across camera lenses and phone screens, no longer just a congresswoman, but the embodiment of a new kind of American hope. Because once the truth is spoken, it doesn't vanish. It grows wings, it echoes, it changes everything. But this was only the beginning, because once you expose the truth, you can't silence it again. And so it ended, not with a scandal, but with a question that cracked the marble surface of power. One question that cut through the noise of markets, the fog of jargon, and the trillion-dollar veil of denial. When Jasmine Crockett looked across that congressional table and asked Jerome Powell to answer for $6 trillion, she wasn't just confronting the man in charge of the Federal Reserve. She was confronting the myth that power is untouchable. That moment became more than politics. It became a mirror, forcing America to look at the cost of silence, the price of complacency, and the courage it takes to speak when everyone else plays it safe. Clips replayed, tweets multiplied. But beneath the digital storm, something real shifted. People started talking again, not about left or right, but about right and wrong, because that's what truth does. It doesn't just inform, it ignites. And as the lights dimmed in that hearing room, one sound lingered above the echoes of paper shuffling and camera shutters. The quiet, steady pulse of accountability finding its rhythm again. In a city built on spin, truth still has a pulse, and it sounds a lot like Jasmine Crockett's voice. If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Stay informed. Speak truth. Share the story, because the fight for accountability doesn't end in Washington. It begins wherever someone refuses to stay silent. Subscribe for more stories where courage meets power. And remember, silence is the most expensive currency of all.